Shaver is our state forester in Indianapolis, and he's going to be helping to moderate the questions that come in, or if anybody would like to make a comment or ask a question or something like that, he'll help to call on you so that we can manage our discussion and interaction and make sure we're not talking over one another. So thank you, Dan, for that. All right, so to get started today, why are we here? Probably because you had an Outlook appointment on your calendar that said you needed to be here, which I can appreciate. But just to kind of step back a little bit, reason why we're meeting this morning is to talk about the Field Office Technical Guide, but this is part of a larger curricula of courses that are required to support Conservation Planner certification. And you're probably familiar with this, at least to some degree, and if not, I would encourage you to take a look at Indiana Bulletin 180-21-3, which is listed on this first slide, and then also to reach out to your area office for more information as you have questions. But this planner certification policy is a formal curricula that the national office has put together to identify various courses that are needed to obtain the skills and knowledge to be recognized as a formal conservation planner. There are a number of courses nationally available, and again, that bulletin goes into great detail on all of that. But the reason why we're here this morning is because what we wanted to do is we wanted to build on those national requirements to make sure that we're providing content that is useful and helpful to you all, as well as appreciate the time it takes to do this. So we wanted to be conscientious and efficient with your time. So there is an Introduction to Field Office Technical Guide national course that's available in AgLearn. However, what we wanted to do is we wanted to provide this to provide a little bit more context as to what Indiana's Field Office Technical Guide has to offer, as well as provide an opportunity to have this discussion as a group, so that if you have questions, other comments you'd like to make, that we can do that together and be a little bit more interactive. So again, appreciate you joining this morning. And again, the presentation is intended to serve multiple purposes. This might be review for some of you, and it might be new information for others. It might be stuff that you remembered at some point but have since forgotten. I know that's what happened to me as I was preparing for this presentation today. So hopefully everybody finds it useful in a different way. We've got a couple hours allotted for this session. I don't know if we'll take all that time or not. If we do, that's just fine. I will say I purposefully tried to hold back on the number of slides that I put together. I realize it is Monday morning, especially after a long weekend. But I also wanted to make sure, in all seriousness, I wanted to make sure that we had ample time to ask questions, to have some interaction if you wanted to bring up a comment as we go through. So please do so. Again, as we go through the slides, feel free to raise your hand or interject so that we can have that conversation. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. If you are on and listening and attending the course, congratulations. You're going to get credit for participating in the Introduction to Field Office Technical Guide course. We're going to go ahead and take attendance here throughout the session, and then we'll use that attendance list to document who's completed this course. And if you're wondering what course this is, if you are looking in your AgLearn profile and kind of monitoring all the courses that you need to take for Certified Planner certification, this is a screen capture of what it looks like in AgLearn. This is the course, and then this is the course number. Stepping back to do a little bit of logistics, I think most folks are familiar with using Microsoft Teams, but just to reinforce some of the concepts here, if you've joined, you've passed the first test, right? You've gotten into Microsoft Teams. But there are some buttons that we use to help kind of manage the interaction of the meetings. Everybody, as I mentioned, it should be on mute for the most part as you'd come in. And of course, you're on mute because you have a microphone, and that microphone has a little X through it to let you know that it's on mute. If you would like to ask a question, you can click on that to take yourself off of mute. You can also use this chat bubble here to type in a question or comment in the chat pod, And again, Dan is going to help kind of monitor that for me so I can focus on the content. And then if you wanted to also, is if you wanted to ask a question but didn't want to interrupt, or wanted to acknowledge that you had a question to ask, you can use this little smiley with the hand, the raise hand feature. So it will alert us that you want to ask a question, and then we would call on you and you could take yourself off of mute to ask. So again, just some functions in Microsoft Teams to help manage our session this morning. All right, any questions on logistics and other stuff before I get started?
Jennifer, this is Dan. There was a question that came up, and I'm new enough, I don't know the answer to this, but can outside partners gain an AgLearn account? Are they able to have one, or is that internal to NRCS?
Excellent question, and I do know the answer. I'm so happy. Partners do have the ability to get an AgLearn account. I'm not going to go into detail on how to do that now, but we do have resources that can help provide some more detail on how to do that and set that up so that you can monitor your course completion in AgLearn like the rest of us. So thank you for asking that question, because others might have been wondering that as well. Thanks, Dan. All right, any more? All right, I'll go ahead and kind of get started here and jump into the meat of the session today. Before I jump into Field Office Technical Guide specifically, I'm just going to kind of step back a little bit and talk about, just kind of remind all of us as to why things like the Field Office Technical Guide are useful. This slide here is a slide I've used in a number of presentations, but anyway, really tries to focus on kind of the key elements and the main approach that we use when we're doing conservation planning. And of course, conservation planning is what we do to support the mission of our agency. And we have a formal process for conservation planning, and you can see a graphic of that over on the right. We have a lot of tools and resources that we use to support our planning work. And part of that is to help the client, of course, manage their resources and potential resource concerns using what we call planning criteria, which we'll get into more detail on what that is as we go through the slide deck. But planning criteria help us identify if a resource concern does indeed exist and when we consider it treated or meeting a minimum level of condition. Part of the planning process also, we talk about the types of conservation plans we develop, and we have a couple different types of plans. We have a progressive type of plan, and then we have a resource management system or RMS level plan, which is a bit more of a comprehensive approach to addressing all the resource concerns that might have been identified on all land uses. RMS type plans aren't required for our work. We aren't required to ask the client to commit to treating all of those resource concerns, but it is something that should be a goal. And because of that, as a goal, as we work through the planning process ourselves, we evaluate a variety of resource concerns on the land use. So we aren't just going out there to focus on the one thing that might have brought us to a farm, but we are going to do a little bit more comprehensive review during the planning process. When we do conservation planning, not only are we considering the resource itself, but we also have to consider the human considerations, the economic and social aspects that will guide the client's decision on whether or not to proceed ahead with the plan. Certainly, I know in my personal and professional life, economic and social considerations dictate how I make my decisions, and we need to be considerate of that when we're working with clients, what their economic and social concerns might be, and how that might impact the decisions they make. Just kind of moving down this list is, again, setting the framework here as we move ahead. NRCS and partner planners will be certified. So if you have those responsibilities as part of your position, we would expect for you to be a certified conservation planner, whether you're an NRCS or a partner employee. So again, thank you to that partner who asked the question about using AgLearn. And then just lastly, why this planning policy and these curricula are important is that conservation plans that are developed will be approved by a certified planner. in addition to the client. So certainly we want the client to make the decision of whether or not they want to proceed ahead with the plan. But in addition to the client, we also want to have a certified planner approve the details of that plan, the practices that we're suggesting, and the other supporting information that was gathered. So this is why the planning policy is a formal process. This is why we have this formal curricula that was established by headquarters. And this is why we have a lot of technical documents and resources available to help assist in this process. And so we'll spend the rest of our time today talking about those resources and that information. So again, a number of programs and tools that support our planning process. You can see here there's a laundry list, and I'm sure I've left off at least a few, just because there is such a long list of resources that are available. Do you need to remember all the specifics of these? Not necessarily offhand. Certainly there'll be some that you probably use more often than not, depending on where you are and the type of work that you do. But you do need to know where to find them when you need them, right? So here's, like I said, a laundry list of a number of tools and resources that we use. Field Office Technical Guide is listed there at the top. And really, several of the tools and items that are listed below in this list are either found in the Field Office Technical Guide or have supporting information that's available in the Field Office Technical Guide to assist you. So that's why that Photog is such a key resource and why we have a kind of a whole course dedicated to talking about it. So we're going to spend most of the rest of our session today digging into details into what is available to you in the Field Office Technical Guide. We're going to take a look at where you can find it, how you can use the Field Office Technical Guide. We're going to, like I said, take a deeper dive into the type of information that's available in it. We're also going to try to relate how the Field Office Technical Guide is used to support the planning process. So if you remember, I mentioned just previously that there's a formal process we use for planning, and that Field Office Technical Guide is integral to getting us the information that we need, helping us make the decisions that we need, developing alternatives, presenting those to the client, and helping them actually implement the plan. All of those aspects of the planning process rely in some way, shape, or form on using bits and pieces of the Field Office Technical Guide. And then at the end, we're going to have a knowledge check. So pop quiz. I'm teasing. It's not nearly as formal as that, but it is a little bit of a question and answer session that I want to go through with you, and just for your own purposes to have you kind of reflect on the content we talked about today. So I appreciate your attention this Monday morning. All right, so just kind of introducing the topic in general. The Field Office Technical Guide is our main technical reference for our agency. It is a website, so it's accessible to both internal folks as well as external folks. So keep that in mind as we go through the type of information that's available. Anything that's posted onto the Photog, and I'll probably start referencing it as Photog just to save myself some time. But anything that's posted on the Photog is intended to be available and potentially used by the public. So as you can imagine, there are some things that we don't post to the Photog because it's for our internal use only. Internal meaning NRCS, partner employees, the folks that do the conservation planning work, and not necessarily the public in general. The Photog is state specific, so it is intended to provide resources that are used within the state. And you'll see some of that as we dig into more details here. And it provides a whole lot of stuff: agency guidelines, criteria, standards, associated tools to support making these decisions, a lot of reference information, just a kind of a cornucopia of documents and supporting information. So we're going to, like I said, go into each in a little bit more detail. One of the big sections that you might be familiar with, and you can see the 5 sections are listed at the bottom of this slide, but one of the sections you might be familiar with, if not any other, is section 4, which is where we have our conservation practice standards. And just I want to reiterate on this slide that when we're talking about providing assistance to our customers, those conservation practice standards provide us the guidelines and the criteria that we need to follow when we're implementing conservation practices. And the guidelines and criteria in those standards are required for us to follow anytime we're providing assistance, whether that's technical or financial assistance. So I point that out specifically because we've had the question come up here and there over the years about, if a customer is not getting EQIP money for tree planting, do they still need to follow our tree planting standard? And what's the answer, Dan? Do they need to?
If they are not getting funding from NRCS?
Yes, then they still want to follow. If they're getting technical assistance from us, they would still want to follow that standard, correct?
Yes.
Yes. So again, just as a reminder, it's something that's popped up. Now the client can decide to not work with us either technically or financially, in which case we might still point them into the direction of the standards that we have because there's a reason why those standards are developed. But then they would have a little bit more latitude to do as they please as far as implementing that practice or planting those trees. But if they are relying on our technical or financial assistance, we must follow those practice standards. All right, and as I said, the bottom part of this slide is a listing of all the 5 sections of the Field Office Technical Guide, and we'll go into each of those in a little bit more detail as we go through the slides. Just want to point out too, I did include a clickable link here in the slide deck, and that's present in a couple different slides, but you can click on the link to go directly to the Field Office Technical Guide website, but we do have postings for the website on our Indiana NRCS website, as well as our Indiana SharePoint site. So there's multiple places where you can get at the Photog if you're wanting to take a look, and if you would like to get on and take a look as we're talking through this, by all means, you can certainly do that. You can also do Google search if you just search, or Microsoft Edge search or whatever. But if you just do a browser search for Field Office Technical Guide, it will route you to the national site, in which case you can select which state you want to look at, i.e. Indiana, and then get at our Indiana site that way. So again, as I mentioned, the Field Office Technical Guide is our primary technical reference, and it contains a lot of information to help identify, evaluate, analyze, and work through the planning process to support our conservation resources. So here's just a reminder of the various resources that we are mindful of when we go through the conservation planning process. These resources require that we follow environmental compliance under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, as well as other state and federal laws. So again, much like we talked about with using conservation practice standards, if NRCS is providing technical or financial assistance, we need to be going through that planning process with the Environmental Policy Act, National Environmental Policy Act in mind, as well as our state and other federal laws. Before I dig into where and what the Field Office Tech Guide contains today, I was just going to provide a little bit of history. And this is, as I was preparing for the presentation today, I was going through a lot of other resources that have been available, and came across this bit of a timeline. And it just serves as a nice reminder of how we got to where we are and why the Photog is such a robust technical reference. As you can see, our agency has been around for a while, and the efforts to support the Field Office Technical Guide started very early in our agency's history. And in fact, 1929 is when the first experimental stations were established across the country. And of course, these experimental stations were the basis for some of the first conservation practice standards that were developed and used within our agency. And that research and testing continued throughout the 1950s through 1980s to evaluate conservation practice standards for ecological reasons as well as engineering needs. And again, we're started to be put together into the first Field Office Technical Guide. And for those of you who might be a little bit newer to the agency, before we had the ePhotog, or the electronic website that I'm referring to now, we actually had a series of binders on the shelf in the office, one for each section that contained all this information in hard copy. So one way or another, the Photog has been a robust resource. It's just changed its look over the years to become more modern, and I will say easier to navigate on the website versus thumbing through binders. But as we continue from history to today, additional programs such as the Emergency Watershed Program were incorporated into the Photog resources, as well as area-wide or watershed-type planning efforts. And then in 1994, our agency was a big year. Our agency had a name change. We switched from the Soil Conservation Service to the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And this name change was intended to recognize that we were evaluating a broader variety of resources than just soil. So again, that graphic I just showed with soil, water, air, plants, animals, etc., that was that broader scope of resources that we now consider as we do conservation planning. Anyway, the reason I wanted to present this slide was, one, I thought it was interesting, but two, just to kind of reiterate that the Photog is a resource that's been developed over time with a lot of input from a lot of different places. It's based on sound science and years of working together with farmers and ranchers on research and demonstration trials, and then also, looking at the practical application of conservation practices. So again, it didn't come from nowhere, and it didn't come from just here in Indiana, although the technical specialists here in Indiana do a great job of providing a lot of great information to post. All right, I'm going to just take a break here for a second, take a drink of water. Anybody have any questions or comments before I continue? All right. So I'm going to just talk through a little bit next in more detail about where you can find the Photog. And I mentioned this already, but what you see on the screen are a couple of screen captures of where you can easily jump into the Indiana Field Office Technical Guide. So the picture on the left here is a picture of our Indiana NRCS website. Chris does a great job of keeping that current and easy to navigate, as well as aesthetically pleasing. But down here, kind of in the bottom middle of that site, is a number of links, and one of those is to the Field Office Technical Guide. The picture over here on the right is a picture from our Indiana SharePoint site. And if you're familiar with the Indiana SharePoint site at all, there's a lot of information there as well. The information on the SharePoint site is a combination of stuff that might be also posted in a public-facing website or on the Photog, but of course our Indiana SharePoint also contains a lot of information that's for internal use only. So depending on which websites you access more, either way you can get at the Photog. But on the Indiana SharePoint site, in addition to the main content, there is a links page or section of the page, and this exists over on the right-hand side of the SharePoint site. And it contains links to a number of important resources, but the Photog is listed down here as well. If you click on either of these links, you'll be directed to the Indiana Field Office Technical Guide. So we have an Indiana specific link now, which is kind of nice. And when you click on that link in either of those locations, this is where you're going to go. So again, it's publicly facing, so anybody can get at it. And once you go here, the main screen is presented to you this way. It's going to show you which state you're in. You could select a different state if you wanted to peruse another state's materials, but it is going to default you to Indiana. And then when you get here, you're going to see some things right off the bat. First of all, you're going to see by default this document tree view. And this document tree view is going to show you each of those 5 sections of the Field Office Technical Guide. And then in addition to the title of the section, you can see here the little down pointing caret, which lets you know there's more information contained underneath those. And as you navigate through this, you'll see these main sections, and then you can expand. You'll see subsections, some of which you can also expand. And this website uses this little caret icon throughout. So if you ever see the down pointing caret, that means there's more information to see. You can click on it and see that additional list of information. As you, excuse me, as you expand out these sections, once you get to kind of the final subsection on the left, you'll see documents display over here on the right. And those documents are items, Word, PDF, Excel tools, a variety of different types of documents. But it will display to you the document title, when it was published, so you know how recent it is, a little bit of an abstract to describe, what the document is or how it should be used, and then allow you to open or access that document from here. So as you dig into all the stuff within Photog, you'll be able to launch those and download a copy to save on your own machine if you want, or open it to view it, to work in it in your active session. So that's all through this document tree, which is kind of the default view for Field Office Technical Guide. So a couple other tabs here. Document search allows you to, you guessed it, search for different documents. And what you'll see is when you're looking at a given document over here on the right, there are certain keywords associated to that document. And so if you wanted to do a search, you could just go into the document search. And if you have a keyword you want to look up, cover crop or trees or watershed, you type in a keyword, do a search, and then the Photog will pull up any document within our Photog that has those keywords associated to it. And then lastly here, if you're just curious on if there's anything that's changed recently in the Photog, you can go to this tab here, and it will show you if documents have been posted recently or not. And it actually even allows you to specify the time frame. How new are you looking? Are you looking within the last 90 days? Are you looking within the last 365 days? You can kind of specify that. So again, this is just the general presentation of what the site looks like. So now let's go in and start walking through each of these sections to talk about what you'll find when you expand these little carets. So we'll start with section 1 and work our way down. Section 1 is called General Resource References, and it's just that. It's a general list of different types of references that are available. And this is a useful section because it can help planners get a feel for the general landscape they're working in, the resources and potential resource concerns that might exist in their work area. And getting familiar with this type of information will help you better identify problems or potential problems that exist, which is step 1 of the planning process. So you can see a listing of all the items that are listed in section 1 if I expand this out. And again, you can see that even within some of these sections, there's additional materials. And I've highlighted just a few of these just to kind of point out that they're here and that they could be of use to you. So the first one listed here is ePhotog transmittals. And essentially what this is a log of notices that have been released to communicate updates. So again, as I mentioned in Photog, there's a ton of information, and that information is reviewed regularly. And when things are changed or updated, we distribute a notice at the state level to let everybody know what's changed. And those notices are helpful because they not only list an item that might have been changed, but usually will include a little bit of a blurb of, what's been updated or what's changed. So it's kind of a handy reference to know that. And so this location shows a log of all the transmittals that have been released over the years. Another really useful item just to be aware of, just for kind of general information purposes, is this maps option. And if you click on the maps in the Photog, you can find that there are a lot of different reference maps available to you. Some of these reference maps are present data that's also available to you to load into ArcMap or display into Conservation Desktop. But the maps that are clickable and available here in the Photog are PDF map documents. So they're a nice summary to show details of specific information, such as maybe watershed boundaries or things like that. Again, the idea being here that this is information that's available to the public. And so PDFs and documents like that are generally able to be opened by most folks. And so the public can view that general resource information if they're interested. Moving down the line, and I don't mean any disrespect by skipping over any of these. I'm just highlighting a few in the interest of time. But another thing in section 1 here is the state payment rates and methods link. If you are ever curious about why we pay $43 an acre for cover crops, or why we pay $36 an acre for cover crops, or nutrient management, or pick your conservation practice, information and details on how that came to be is available here in the state payment rates and methods link. This spot also includes a link to the national payment schedule website. So, if you're ever interested and want to compare what Kentucky pays for nutrient management versus Oklahoma versus Vermont, you can get at any and all that information here as well. And then last but certainly not least, in section 1, I want to point out that there are a series of technical notes available here through the technical notes link. And these are great resources available to you as internal employees, but also again to the public. They are written so that the public is an intended audience, but they're a variety of topics. And we've got subfolders underneath here for agronomy, biology, forestry, and grazing. And again, each of them are 1 to 2 pages max and customer oriented to provide specific information on certain topics. And so I would encourage you, I think I have a couple examples to show here, but I would encourage you to take a look at those because the technical staff does a really good job of creating technical notes for topics that are timely and again, developing them in a way that's easy to understand by both us as well as the customer. So just a couple examples of what you see when you dive into some of the details of section 1. So this is going back to the payment rates subsection there. And again, as I mentioned, there's a whole lot of information if you ever wanted to know how our payment rates came to be. This is an example of what's called a payment scenario detail. So for every payment rate that we have in our cost lists, in our payment rate details, we have the practice, conservation practice, and then we have a specific scenario. And when we develop this information, we have to specify what this particular scenario is, what the concern is before the practice is applied, and then what the intended result is after the practice is applied. And in addition to that, we also have to define the number of acres of seed, the number of acres of equipment needed to cover that seed or apply that seed, the types of equipment that are used, all the bits and pieces that go into actually implementing a practice. And so it's kind of the building blocks of how we create our payment scenarios. But all of this information for every practice and every payment scenario is available under that section 1, if you're ever curious. And then another example of another resource there available under section 1. This is one example of one of the tech notes that are saved there. And you can see here, this is an agronomy technical note. And this topic is the top 15 basics for no-till corn success. So again, you can see here how this information is laid out, nice and succinct, but useful. And so again, I would encourage you to take a look at that if you're not familiar with those technical notes in section 1.
Jennifer, can I interrupt you with a question for a second?
Absolutely.
This is a personal question for me. With the the scenario descriptions that you had there with the pricing, when those are published, we often refer that our payment scenarios cover about 75% of the cost of a practice.
Mm-hmm.
Is what's published in the the scenario that you show there, is that the full cost of it, or is that tend to be what we estimate would be 75% of the cost? Does that make sense?
It makes sense, and it's an excellent question. I appreciate you circling back on that because I should have pointed that out. But again, even better that you asked that as a question. So yeah, so looking at this example, and like I said, they exist for all of our practices and scenarios. We've got the unit, we've got the typical size of 100 acres in this example, and then we've got the total scenario cost, and then the scenario cost per unit, which in this case is the total divided by 100, right? So this scenario cost right here is the 100% estimated cost of putting this in. So to your question, Dan, if this were in equip and we offer 70, what we consider to be 75% of the rate, this would be multiplied by 75%. If we were working with a historically underserved producer, our rate is 90%. And so this would be multiplied by 90%. But regardless, when you're looking at these documents, the important point to keep in mind is that this is showing the 100% estimated cost. And so if we're working on financial assistance with a customer, they're going to be getting less than this, either the 75 or 90% rate, depending. Good question. Any other comments or questions? I'm going to get ready to kind of move on to the next section, or section 2. So any other questions folks want to ask about anything I've shown in section 1? All right, moving right along. Section 2. Section 2 is natural and cultural resources information. And as you can see by the screen capture on the right, it's a long list. There's lots of good stuff in here. And really, again, Section 2 is another informative and supporting section that can help planners get a feel for the landscape and resources in their work area. So I really look at Section 2 along with Section 1 as both good resources to help planners better determine the objectives the client might have, and as well as to, again, help get their bearings on what resources to evaluate, what potential resource concerns there might be. So again, a lot of good general information here. And again, I'm just hitting on a few of these, although as you can see here, there is lots of information available within this section. The first one I just want to highlight here is the detailed soil information, property quality and soil interpretations. This is where you can find some specifics regarding soils, including the frozen HEL soils lists. There's crop yields by soil map unit, and a whole lot more information. So again, good general references for soils. There is a section or a couple sections here for supporting highly erodible land information. So the HEL or highly erodible land determinations, as well as HEL for non-compliance use. These sections contain information such as how to determine if land is highly erodible, technical guidance for determining residue levels, the Indiana Erodibility Index tool, which is used to figure erodibility index values, and more. So again, a lot of good stuff here to support the work that we do with highly erodible lands. There's various natural resources information here. Again, that's the title of this section, but just to kind of point out a few here, we've got T&E species references, we've got cultural resources references, nitrate leaching, Indiana special streams. I mean, you can read through the list, but just lots of good information to help set the stage for what the landscape is like in your work area and or on a particular farm before you head out there. And that's, I talk about section 1 and section 2 as helping planners get a feel for the landscape. And, one of the things we talk about in our conservation planning training is the value of pre-planning. And essentially what that means to me and how I like to think of it is getting your ducks in a row before you go out to a farm. So if you're getting ready to go out to a farm or getting ready to have a conversation with a customer, the more information that you have that you can take a look at before that conversation, it means a couple things. One, it means you're going to be more efficient with your time and the customer's time because you have a better idea of what questions to ask and what to look at. And two, taking that time to do a bit of pre-planning and get your ducks in a row, so to speak, gives you more confidence. You may not need that confidence. You might be super familiar with all aspects of the work area that you work in and the clients that you work with. But most of us, myself included, benefit from having a little bit more confidence going into anything I do. And so planning ahead and getting those bearings is very helpful to be more confident in that conversation. So anyway, section 1, section 2, these sections can help give you that confidence, providing you those resources to do a little bit of pre-planning and investigatory work before you actually meet with a customer on site or on the phone or anything else in the office. Sorry, I digress. I'll get back to the content here on the slide. Last thing I wanted to point out here is there are watershed maps available in section 2. And these are really handy. I'm going to show you an example of one of these here in a minute. But again, they're intended to be public facing or optional and available to the public. So they're presented in a way that allows folks to easily view and gain some basic information about the watershed they might live in. So let's take a look. So again, this is an example of what one of the watershed maps looks like. And this is a shout out to the cartographic team in Indianapolis and our GIS coordinator who worked to put great resources like this together for us. If you go to Watershed Maps, you can look at any number of watersheds within the state, pull up a map, and you can see a lot of great information about it. You can see an inset here of where in the state it exists. You can see how it's divided into smaller watersheds. And then it also contains summary information, including how many acres of that watershed exist in each county. So again, just use some useful information that can help you with watershed plan work, as well as more localized on-farm work. Another example of information available under Section 2 is our natural resources, including T&E species. And so here's a document of an example of some of what's located under T&E species or threatened and endangered species. This is an example of the requirements that need to be considered or need to be followed, excuse me, when we're providing assistance to make sure and protect the Indiana bat and northern long-eared bat. So just to point out here, when you look at things like T&E species folder, and this actually applies to the cultural resources folder as well, what you're going to find here is general guidance and information related to those topics. And the reason for that is, if you remember, I keep mentioning that the Photog is a public-facing site, right? It's a website available to anybody. So you're not going to find a listing of where the T&E species are in Indiana. You're not going to find a listing of where the cultural resources sites are in Indiana. Why? Because we don't want the public to necessarily know that information. But what you are going to find is general information about why T&E species are an important item to consider during the planning process, why cultural resources are an important consideration or important thing to consider as we go through the planning process, both for our benefit to know internally, but also, again, the client can view this stuff and begin to get an understanding of why this is important and why we have to consider it. Why we might have to hold up a project a little bit to make sure that we're not going to destroy a cultural resource. Again, having this type of information available on a public-facing site helps set that stage to support the work that we do. Again, there's a whole lot of information under Section 2, and I've just talked about a little bit of it. But again, just a couple of examples of nice resources that are available to you and how you might find them useful in your work. Moving on to Section 3, another big section with a lot of information. So we'll dive into those. So Section 3 is called Resource Concerns and Planning Criteria. and you can see a screen capture of section 3. And there's a couple specific items I'm going to point out and point to here. One of those items here, resource concern list and planning criteria, has a whole lot of additional information underneath it, so much so that I included a screen capture of this. So if I clicked here to expand this item down, I would see this list of resources available to me. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about all the stuff in section 3 and why it's important to know where it is to put your hands on it. So first, but certainly important as well, is our conservation activity plans information. So under conservation activity plans technical criteria, there's a number of resources, including CAP templates or activity plan templates and criteria needed, as well as the checklist to confirm deliverables. So this section 3, we're starting to move away from kind of just general information and knowledge that we talked about in sections 1 and 2, but now we're starting to get a little bit more into the next phase of the conservation planning process is when we're starting to actually do an inventory of resources and starting to analyze those resources. So we're inventorying resources, and as part of the planning process, if we're not completing that planning process ourselves, the conservation activity plans help provide the guidance and the specifics of what's needed for our TSPs to develop those conservation plans for us. So that's where all this information kind of ties together. The other main section here that I want to spend time on in section 3 is this resource concern list and planning criteria. And again, all this stuff that is in existence underneath this folder here. It contains a lot. In the resource concern list, there is a document that's, I want to say 172 pages last I checked, but 170 some odd pages, which is provides a formal listing of all of our resource concerns and our planning criteria. It's a good reference. I wouldn't necessarily recommend sitting down and reading it from page 1 to page 172, but it is a good reference. And what the document does is it explains each resource and resource concern we evaluate. It identifies how we define that concern, when we would consider the resource to actually be a resource concern, meaning needing treatment, as well as how we would treat it or things to consider, and the criteria that we need to meet in order to consider that resource concern treated. So I like to think about it as a measuring stick. So our planning criteria is the main tool that we use as the measuring stick to determine if a resource concern is present, as well as to consider when a resource concern can be considered treated. Okay, there's always a better, right? There's always a better condition that we can do. And honestly, in a lot of, or in some cases, the best condition might be not doing anything on the ground, meaning we wouldn't farm crops, we wouldn't do anything. But that's not really a feasible alternative, because I like to eat and you guys probably all do too. So using a planning criteria allows us to identify a working condition that we could get to for cropland, let's say, that still allows the customer to work the land, but do so in a way that maintains a minimum level of treatment to consider the resource treated. So there's a number of tools and resources that are available to help support the measuring stick and the act of actually measuring to determine if the resource concern is present and or if it's considered treated. We've got a questions tool here that's listed here, and it's the CART assessment questions tool. And without going into a whole lot of detail on this call, CART stands for Conservation Assessment and Ranking Tool, which is an internal website that we use as planners to assess resources, and if a producer is interested in financial assistance, rank those assessments to consider them for financial assistance. So again, I won't go into a whole lot of detail on what all that is, but our CART system and our CART tools that we use internally rely on the planning criteria that are outlined in this resource concerns document. So that was a mouthful, and I apologize because I'm shortening some of these topics just for the sake of time. But what I want to point out here, getting back to the field office technical guide itself, is that it's really nice that this list of resource concerns and the measuring stick that we use is available for the public to view. It's available for the public to view. It's available for other partners that don't necessarily work in our internal systems, consultants, other folks that are out there that are providing assistance to clients and landowners in Indiana. So certified crop advisors, and you just, run the gamut of anybody. They can access this information so that they know what we're using to make the decisions in the planning process, as well as in, to some degree, the ranking and funding of applications process too. All right, so these first two sub-bullets here, the list of resource concerns and planning criteria, and this CART questions tool, again, really get at trying to identify resource concerns and resource treatment needed. In a lot of cases, these documents refer to using other technical tools or assessment tools to make the decision of whether the concern exists or whether the concern is considered treated. And so those assessment tools are available over here in this screen capture under resource concern list and planning criteria. So for example, if you're doing conservation planning out on pasture, you use an assessment tool called the pasture condition score sheet, which is a field-based assessment to determine a variety of factors with regards to the pasture, diversity of species, the amount of cover, I'm going to do a poor job of this, but a bunch of other things that you would assess in the field to evaluate the general condition of the pasture. And based on those scores or that assessment that you conduct out in the field, you would answer the questions back to this list of concerns and planning criteria. You would answer the questions, which would then help identify whether a resource concern associated with, let's say, degraded plant condition exists. And it's going to be based on your answers to tools such as what's contained in the pasture condition score sheet. And so we have a number of resources available. We have a soil health assessment. I believe Stephanie McLean, our soil health specialist, has done some great trainings on walking through the soil health assessment. But again, that is another tool that's used to help answer questions to help determine if a resource concern exists or if it's considered treated. So again, lots of good information just right in here, not to mention in section 3 as a whole. So kind of backing up off of this bottom screen here, back up to this section 3 screen capture, there are resource concern information sheets. Oh, excuse me, I'm down here still, apologize. There are resource concern information sheets that are in Photog, and I'm going to show you an example of one of these here in a little bit. But again, with the public in mind, these information sheets are a nice summary way of explaining why we care about degraded plant condition, why we care about compaction, why we care about the various resource concerns that we evaluate. And then special environmental concerns are similar information sheets that help explain why, again, why we have to consider or why we need to consider special environmental concerns as part of the NEPA process and as part of the planning process as well. So before I leave the topic of identifying resource concerns, because it is such a key component of what we do in the planning process, just wanted to kind of provide this visual, and I've used it elsewhere, so you've probably seen it before, many of you. But getting back to that concept of a measuring stick, right? What this graphic is intended to show, and this is the information to help answer these questions, is contained in section 3 here under this resource concern list and planning criteria. But what this is intended to show is a graphical representation of how we use that information. So what we do is we evaluate the current condition out on the landscape. When we go out and do farm planning, or we're having that discussion with the producer in the office, or a combination of both, we're getting an idea of what the existing condition is out there on the landscape. And that existing condition might include some conservation practices that producer has done in the past that they maintain. but it's all the stuff that's out there currently. And so we answer questions related to that existing condition, which gives us kind of a benchmark or starting point with where the operation is at relative to the various resource concerns that we consider. But our target, what we're trying to achieve, is this vertical line here called or threshold value. So when each of the resource concerns that we're evaluating meets this threshold value, we can consider that resource concern to be treated. And so you can see here that there might be gaps, and in this example, there's gaps. And what our role as conservation planners is to evaluate the resources, use our assessment tools, use those various things that are available in the Photog to help, one, identify the existing condition, but then also to provide alternatives of activities and practices that that client can do on their farm or on their land to help meet those threshold values. So I haven't really talked much about how we would move the bar to the right here with planned practices and priorities, but I'm going to talk about that here as I round out this presentation. But again, when I think about planning criteria, which is what we're basically talking about here, and using it as a measuring stick, what we're talking about is, shooting for this threshold value and assessing where the resources currently are in a given operation and what practices and activities we can consider proposing to the client, which they will ultimately choose, but we want to pitch to them alternatives that can help address and treat those resource concerns. Do we need to treat all of the resource concerns? Anybody want to venture a guess, throw out a guess, yes or no? All right, I'm seeing in the chat pod, Mike Hughes said no. You're correct. Do we have to treat all the resource concerns? No. And in fact, it's the client's decision on which resource concerns they want to address, right? Again, going back to those key elements that I presented earlier in the presentation, not only are we evaluating the resources, but we have to consider the human aspect as well, right? The economic, the social aspects of things. And even though there might be a number of things that should be addressed or we'd recommend addressing, the producer might not have or the client might not have the economic resources to do that. They might not have the people resources. They might not have, the number of people working on the farm or working on the land to actually get all that stuff done. So you're exactly correct, Mike. We don't have to address all of these resource concerns, and that's where progressive planning comes in. So progressive planning is how we're working with that client to achieve some benefits based on what they want to treat or what they're committed to treating first. And then maybe we're working with them over time to get to a more comprehensive plan of addressing more concerns, which if we were to treat all of those concerns that are identified, we would have a resource management system plan or an RMS level plan. So that's how all that ties together. But as planners, we go out and we evaluate these various concerns, present those to the customer, and then let them choose, what they're willing or what they're able to treat. But again, we got to know where we're starting, and we got to know what needs to be done or have a good idea of what needs to be done in order to meet those threshold values. And the tools in section 3 of the Photog go a long way to helping put all those dots together to identify which resource concerns are present, what the existing condition is, how close we are to that threshold with just the current existing conditions. And in some cases, we might have met the concern already with existing conditions, and therefore resource concern is not present. But where we have this gap between what's existing and the threshold, then we can start to consider what practices and activities we can suggest to the client to help close that gap to meet the threshold or even exceed it. All right. I'm sorry I spent quite a bit of time on that, but that's near and dear to my heart. So, and I think it's a big component of what we do. So hopefully that helps lay some groundwork for those who aren't as familiar with that process as Mike is for getting chiming in and getting the right answer too. So thanks again, Mike. So just to step back a little bit and talk about the stuff that you'll find under Section 3. Again, there's a lot there, so I just included a couple screen captures. But for example, one of the things I'd mentioned a few slides ago is the information related to conservation activity plans. And that in Section 3, you can find conservation activity plan criteria, checklists, deliverables, and things like that. This is an example of one of those. So this is an example of a CNMP, or a comprehensive nutrient management plan, which is one of the types of CAPs that are available to customers. And again, when we talk about CAPs, we're talking about folks other than ourselves developing this information, technical service providers, other folks that are qualified to help support the planning process. And so what ends up happening is we have these other folks that help support our mission. They develop a CAP, such as a CNMP, and then they provide that information to us. Well, did they provide everything that they were supposed to? Did they provide everything that the customer needs, or that we need to move on to the next phase of planning specifics and implementing the plan? You might not know, and I might not know, but guess what? We've got these checklists that are available in Section 3 that can help guide through the process. So again, checklists like this are intended to identify all the bits and pieces that should be contained in that CAP plan. And again, this is on the Photog public-facing site. Those technical service providers, the customer that's hiring the technical service provider, everybody has access to this information, so there shouldn't be any surprises when the CAP plan is handed in. It should contain all the bits and pieces that we need. The next couple things I'm going to show are just a snapshot of some of the information that is available in Section 3, going back to the resource concerns and the planning criteria side of things. A couple resources and tools that are available to help support you in that effort. So this is a screen capture of the CART assessment questions report tool for Indiana. And this is an Excel, macros enabled Excel spreadsheet, but it's intended to be a tool to help guide you when you're doing conservation planning work with those customers. And essentially what it does is it has some widgets built in to allow you to, once you select the land uses that you're expecting to find out on a farm or on a property, if you select those land uses and some other associated questions related to that operation, such as if there's nutrients applied or pesticides, or if they have confined animals, etc. Once you specify that information over here, particular resource concerns that you should be evaluating as a planner highlight over on the rest of the spreadsheet. So it's intended to guide you to that. If you're going out to evaluate cropland, you should be looking at erosion. You should be looking at nutrient transport. You should be looking at some soil quality resource concerns to identify if those exist. And so we have this set up to highlight those resource concerns based on whichever land uses that you're expecting to go out to find. Once these are highlighted here, you can select those. So it will actually put a checkbox next to each of those. And then over off the screen here, but as part of this tool as well, once you've selected the land uses, the other criteria, and once the resource concerns that you should be evaluating highlight, you can actually generate a list of questions that you need to be thinking of and getting the answers to as part of your planning visits. So again, the intent here is it helps put in your hands the types of things you need to be thinking of, the questions that you need to be asking, as well as, and I'll show you here in a second, providing some guidance to you on how to answer those questions based on what you see out in the field, based on those conversations that you have with the producer. So again, this is really trying to get at being more efficient with your time, being more efficient with the customer's time when you have them, making sure that you're asking the questions that you need, getting the information that you need while you have their dedicated time. And so once you go through this tool and select this information, you can generate a list of questions, And in this example here, this is just one example, but looking at compaction. If we identified in the previous screen here that compaction was a resource concern that we needed to evaluate, well, what are you evaluating when it comes to compaction? You're going to be answering the question, is compaction significant or isn't it? Well, maybe I don't know what significant compaction is. Don't worry, there's additional guidance associated with these questions and with these response options that you have. So you can see here, just as an example, Indiana has provided some guidance for things to take a look at when you're out there. Okay, as well as you can see here some national guidance on tools and measurements that you can take to determine if compaction is significant or not. So again, this is hopefully supporting some training that's been received, as well as just experience that you've either gotten over the years or are working to get to help make those determinations. But our intent with all of this is to help provide you some guidance to use while you're out there to help make those determinations. And this can be printed out, taken out with you in the field so you can, again, know what you need to look at and even make some markings to answer those questions so that when you bring it back into the office to do your analysis, you've got the information that you need. All right. Some of the other resources that are available in Section 3, I'm kind of circling back out here, talking a little bit more about the information that's available, information sheets that are available for us internally, but also for the public. Here's just a couple examples. So these are special environmental concerns information sheets. And again, this one is for the Clean Water Act. I'll go ahead and throw up the other one here for migratory birds. But you can see that it provides a little bit of background on what this is, why we care about it, what can be done about it, etc. So again, as you're working through the planning process and we have to do additional checks and balances to make sure that we're adhering to the Clean Water Act or to make sure that we're not negatively impacting any migratory birds, if you have a customer that's, wondering why we have to do this, these information sheets are available. And these are just a couple examples, but you can see here the way these are all set up. Here's a list over here on the left of all the various special environmental concern information sheets that are available. I just picked out a couple. All right, any questions on Section 3, resource concerns, planning criteria, caps, and information sheets, any of the other information I presented before I move on to Section 4? Okay. Moving
Yep.
right along. Oh,
Yep,
go ahead, Dan.
we're looking good in the chat, Jennifer. The special environmental concern worksheets, those are all national publications, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep. Excellent. Thank you, Dan.
Mhm.
All right, moving on to Section 4. So we've got 5 sections total. So we've got Section 4 and Section 5 yet that we're going to talk through. Section 4 is our practice standards and supporting documents section. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, if you are familiar with one section of this Photog, this is probably it, Section 4, because this is where our conservation practice standards live. But hopefully, throughout this presentation, you've gotten some gauge of other cool stuff and important information that's available to you. But anyway, circling back to Section 4 here, practice standards and supporting documents. I do want to take a minute to just explain what these are, especially for those folks who might not be familiar with this section. Section 4, and of course, along with the other sections we've already presented, are actually going to help planners formulate alternatives when you're doing conservation planning. And so if you think about the conservation practices, they're used different ways for treating different things, and the standard itself goes into detail as to how it can be used and where it applies, and I'll get to that in a minute. But you can use this information as a planner to help start to formulate different alternatives for which practices you might recommend to the client to treat the concerns, resource concerns that have been identified. So this is where some of that starts to come together. Each conservation practice that we offer will have a standard and or specification, but it will definitely at least have a standard. And the conservation practice standard, again, is that framework that defines what the practice is, where it can be used, sometimes where it doesn't apply or where it shouldn't be used, depending on the practice, as well as the purposes of implementing that standard, or what, like I said, what purpose it should serve. Specifications and other supporting documents, such as job sheets and implementation requirements, some cases statements of work, those documents provide more specific details. So the specifications provide some more detail, and the job sheets or implementation requirements get even more specific to document how a particular producer or client would implement a particular practice on their farm. And I use these terms, job sheets and implementation requirements, together. Job sheets have been the historical title we've used for these documents. The agency is moving more toward using the term implementation requirements. So as you're navigating in Section 4, for a while, you're probably going to see a combination of both. As we retire out those older, that job sheet terminology, and bring on new or updated documents, we'll probably start to refer to the term implementation requirements more. But you'll see both terms for a while, and they're essentially the same. But thinking about conservation practice standards and these more specific documents that go along with them, the conservation practice standards, they're intended to identify that minimum level of quality that we're striving for when we're doing planning, designing, and implementation, as well as operation and maintenance. So the conservation practice standard goes into all of that detail, including things to be mindful of for maintaining the practice over the lifespan of the practice. And then again, those other documents down here, job sheets, implementation requirements, those are really more client focused and should provide that specific information the client needs to implement the practice on their land. I will note that in Section 4 of the Photog, most of the specifications that you're going to find within the Field Office Technical Guide are more ecological in nature. The engineering specifications are actually stored on the Indiana NRCS website. So just another reference of another place you might look for that type of information. Both the Photog and our Indiana website are public facing, so the public has access to those details if they wanted to take a look. They're available to them, and that might be helpful if you're working through the planning process. If you have a producer or client who's nervous about implementing a practice or has questions about it, these specifications might help provide a little bit more information as to what the expectation is. What you're getting yourself into if you decide to go ahead and implement this practice. So that's helpful information. So all of this stuff up here in this top section of the slide is contained under conservation practice standards and support documents. The other item listed here in Section 4 is ecological sciences tools. And under ecological sciences tools, there are a number of tools, as you might have guessed, that help support generating some of these job sheets and site-specific details for implementing conservation practices. Controlled traffic is a tool that's there, not widely used, but that's where it is. There's a fence tool to help with the design of the fence practice. And then there's a number of other tools associated with coming up with cover crop mix recommendations, fertility tool, seeding recommendations, wildlife seeding tool recommendations, etc. But that, again, will help put together that specific information for a customer that can then be communicated along with the job sheets or implementation requirements. So I'll take a look at what a couple of these look like. So this is an example of a practice standard, and I'm picking on cover crops again. Most of you are probably familiar with this standard already, but that's another reason why I picked it. But each standard is developed with kind of the same, well, with the same framework and with the same sections for the most part and the same type of information, where it's going to define what the actual practice is. It's going to list to you the purposes, what you can achieve by implementing this practice, and the way that this practice is implemented, those specific details that you come up with in things like the cover crop tool, and share within those implementation requirements, those specifics might hit on one or more of these purposes, right? So not every instance of cover crops is going to hit all of these different purposes, but depending on those specifics and what you develop, you might hit on multiple purposes. And then the standard explains conditions where the practice applies. And you can see that listed here. And then the other item that you can't necessarily see in this document, but is another part of the standard is criteria. So the criteria that are applicable to the practice. And so the criteria that are applicable are those things that you have to consider, or excuse me, those items that you have to keep in mind when you're talking about implementing the practice. Okay, so criteria are things that must be followed. Conversely, there are also considerations that are included in a practice standard. And so you can see here, considerations are the things that are optional to the planner, but are things that are also beneficial, right? So if you can consider those and work those in as part of the recommendations for implementing the practice, great. Do you have to work in the considerations? No. Okay, those are optional. But the criteria, that information as part of the standard, are things that you have to incorporate when you're implementing the practice. Again, these standards are helpful. They are, like I said, they're on the field office technical guide, so they're available to us internally as well as to the customer. They do provide some good information, but again, they're not site specific, so they're really more general in nature to give some ideas to what the practice means. On the other hand, the job sheets or implementation requirements that are available for practices get more specific. And this is an example of a cover crop job sheet. And again, it's intended to be focused on the client. In an example like this, the cover crop job sheet would be used along with the specific recommendations for seeding that were developed out of the cover crop tool. That's also available here in section 4. But again, you can see here that these are written to provide some more specific information as to why this is a beneficial practice. And again, this is written more client-facing than maybe even the practice standard is, for sure. Any comments, questions on section 4? And I would encourage, I've glossed over this quite a bit, and the technical specialists in the state do a fantastic job of providing resources with job sheets, implementation requirements, updating the tools that are available, all of those things. So if any of you are on and you would like to chime in with a comment as well, please, by all means, feel free to do so. All right. With that, we will move into the last, but certainly not least, section of the Field Office Technical Guide, Section 5. Section 5 is titled Conservation Effects, and that's essentially what its type of information it contains. Conservation effects really builds on the other sections 1 through 4. But when you think about this section of the Photog and how it relates to the planning process, this is really where the resources in this section can really help planners evaluate alternatives while doing conservation planning. So, again, as you're trying to reach that threshold mark, right, you're using that measuring stick to try to achieve a minimum level of treatment. You can use the practice standards that we just presented, as well as what the effects of those practices are on the different resources, information that's contained here in section 5. You can use that information to really start to try to close those gaps to reach those minimum treatment values, or even exceed those values, depending on what the client is interested in doing. But this Section 5 really contains a lot of resources to help quantify the amount of benefit that our conservation practices can provide, to really help, like I said, guide the planner in coming up with some alternatives to present to the customer. Not only can this information help to evaluate alternatives or decide, which practice alternatives to present, but it also can help us help the client make informed decisions. Um, as we go through the planning process, it's the client that decides what to do, right? Not us. We provide the information, present the alternatives, answer questions, but then ultimately the customer is the one that makes the call on what they want to do. And so again, having some amount of guidance on how much benefit different things will provide on the landscape can help that client make a more informed decision. So again, that's really what this section is getting at, is background information on how conservation practices affect the resource concerns that we might be evaluating. And so to that end, you can see here a screen capture of what's in Section 5. There are a few items, and I'll point out mainly this top one, but this top one is called the CART Practice Point Spreadsheet, and I'm going to show it here in a minute. But this tool is intended to help quantify how much conservation benefit each practice will provide. The amount of benefit depends. How much benefit does a given practice provide? How much benefit does nutrient management provide? How much benefit does conservation cover provide? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on which resource concern we're looking to treat with that. And it depends on what land use that conservation practice is going to be implemented on. So key factors that go into, how much benefit a practice might provide, and therefore key factors that will dictate which practices we might consider suggesting, right? Key factors would include the resource concerns we're trying to address, as well as the land use we're trying to address those on. The CART practice point spreadsheet is relatively new. It was really introduced last year when the conservation assessment and ranking tool itself was introduced in the agency. But the concept of quantifying benefits is nothing new, or trying to quantify benefits is nothing new. Prior to this point spreadsheet that we use now, the agency tried to quantify benefits of practices using what was called the CPPE. So many of you are probably familiar with the CPPE or have at least heard of it. But the CPPE is the Conservation Practice Physical Effects document. And it's more historical in nature in that our planning tools and other things that we use don't directly reference the CPPE anymore. They directly reference this CART practice point spreadsheet. But this is useful historical information. And what's interesting about the CPPE is that it tried to quantify benefits using numbers from 5 to -5. So this information is still available on the Photog if you're ever interested. +5 is the most benefit. 0 is no benefit or no impact. But what's different about CPPE is that it actually also tried to account for the negative impacts of a practice. And so as many of you know, the process of doing conservation planning is complex, and so many things are interrelated with one another in the environment that if we implement a practice to benefit one concern, we may, inadvertently be harming or negatively impacting another concern. And so the CPPE really tried to capture that. Was it perfect? No. But it was intended to be just a guide to help give a relative idea as to the impacts of practices. So even though we're using the CART method and that spreadsheet and our tools directly, both I think can provide some useful information when we're trying to quantify benefits and come up with alternatives to the customer. Let's take a look here quickly at what that looks like. So this is just a screen capture, and I'm referring back up to this one because this is the more current one that we're using in our tools. But you can see here, it's a big spreadsheet, but filters are your friend. I always like to, if I'm using this tool, I always like to open it up and then start to filter by things immediately, depending on what I want to look at, just to kind of help manage the amount of information I'm looking at. But in this example here, I've filtered the practice to cover crop. And so if I filter the practice to cover crop, this spreadsheet's going to show me a couple things. First of all, it's going to show me any resource concern that cover crop might help address. So anything that, you know, isn't listed here is not associated with providing benefits through cover crops. But then what it also does here over here is it's helping to quantify the amount of benefit. And again, that's depending on the land use. And it's dependent upon the type of resource concern we're trying to benefit. So you can see here that, and we can argue this all day and all night. I'm not planning to, but we can all have our different opinions on this. But in this example, you can see here that cover crops generally provide a little bit more benefit to compaction than they do addressing organic matter depletion. And the reason I say that is because the value here is 25 benefit points, so to speak, versus 15 benefit points. Likewise, you can see that there's variability depending on the land use. So if you're doing cover crops on cropland, you're going to probably have more success in benefiting compaction than if you were planting cover crops on associated ag land, which might seem kind of obvious because of the amount of management and work that goes on crop ground. But anyway, that's part of how this spreadsheet is set up and can help, like I said, provide you some insight on those alternatives. Is this correct every time? Mostly yes, but your professional judgment comes in here as well. Should this be 26 or 27 of a value? Maybe. These are relative values. So don't get hung up on the actual numerical value, but this can be helpful for citing relative quantity or relative amount of benefit based on this practice versus others or this land use versus others. So please use it that way. All right, so that's really what I wanted to talk about with regards to the conservation effects side of things. We'll round out the planning process and relating to the field office technical guide. We talked about a number of the steps in the planning, the 9 steps of conservation planning, but once we use those resources in the Photog to get a better feel ourselves for the landscape and the concerns, inventory those resources to determine if there's concerns, propose alternatives, and then present those to the client for he or she to make the decision on what to actually go ahead with. Now it actually comes time to implementing the plan and then following up, maybe even and evaluating that plan. And so again, as I've really gone through these sections, I've really tried to tie that back to the steps in the planning process. And again, using practice standards and specifications and implementation requirements, that provides that site-specific information so that the client can actually implement the plan. So that's really how that ties together. All those building blocks of that general resources, as well as the details that you develop through the practice standards and specifications. And then step 9, evaluating the plan. Those conservation effects tools that I just covered, not only can those tools in section 5 help you identify which practice alternatives to propose, but it can turn around and help evaluate how successful those practices were when they are on the landscape. So if you're able to, as you're working with the customer, once those practices are implemented, if you can get feedback on how effective they were, then that'll help you know how accurate those benefit point values are, or conditions where it does apply or doesn't necessarily apply quite as well. But getting that site-specific feedback can really help play into that as you work on the next plan and as you gain your own experience as a planner. And if you think about it, that's, as I mentioned the slide early on that went through the history of the Photog, that's really how it started, right? We had experimental stations. research plots, etc., that helped form the Photog, and the interactions that you have with producers in your own county or landowners within your own county help to solidify that, and or might even shed light on some tweaks that need to be made and updates that need to be made in the Photog going forward. All right, I've got just a couple more slides. I appreciate y'all hanging in here with me. But just a couple more things I wanted to talk about. We do have historically, we've had a field office technical guide committee. We've had a number of folks that would volunteer to serve on the field office tech guide committee. They would serve for, I believe it was a 3-year term, and they would be charged with reviewing updates to standards and associated documents and providing feedback. The committee was comprised of a variety of positions: field office staff, area office staff, other specialists inside the agency as well as outside of the agency that worked together to refine updates, make sure that updates to standards were clear and understandable and written, that way as to the best of our ability, those types of things. That committee hasn't met in a little bit, but we're in the state, we're actually evaluating kind of a new approach or a different approach to getting that feedback when we have changes to make to standards and associated documents. So stay tuned for that. But the changes that are looking to be made are hopefully to get more involvement from a number of folks rather than saddling a small team of people with a 3-year term commitment to do this. So hopefully to get more engagement and involvement, especially because there's a number of things that are going to be updated coming in the near future. So I don't have a whole lot of detail on that now, but just a little teaser, I guess, to expect to hear more of that come this next fiscal year. And then as I close, I just kind of want to circle back to why we asked you all to sign in today, this morning, and participate in this course. And I, again, really appreciate your attention. I know it's tough to sit and listen to something like this for an hour plus, but I, again, appreciate it. And hopefully you found some useful information. But the reason why we're here is, again, this is a course that is part of the curricula in our conservation planner certification policy. This course specifically is required for level 1, 2, 3, or 4 planners. So any designation needed to have this Intro to Field Office Technical Guide course. But there might be a number of you who want to be able to approve conservation plans, who want to achieve that level 3 certified planner status so that you can approve those conservation plans yourself. So as such, I wanted to just provide this slide as a reminder of the types of things that you need to be working toward in order to achieve that level 3 certification. So again, this course is one of those that is required in the policy, but the Indiana bulletin listed here goes into great detail on all the course requirements and all the things that are associated for any of the levels of planner designation, including level 3. All right, with that, I've just got a couple things left. I just wanted to circle back on, if you do have questions that pop up, reach out to your area staff. Your area resource management specialist is a great resource. Myself, Jennifer Chen, our state resource conservationist, Shannon Zazula, are all available to help point you in the right direction. There's a lot of information in the field office technical guide, as I've mentioned a few times, and sometimes it's the hardest thing is knowing where to go look. So if you're struggling with that, reach out and we can kind of help point you in the right direction. So as I close out, I'll ask again if anybody would like to make any comments or questions in the chat pod, whether it's field staff or technical specialists that are on the line. And don't hang up on me yet, because I do have a knowledge check I want you to participate in. So please don't go anywhere. Questions, comments? All right, thank you guys. I appreciate it. Like I said, don't go anywhere. What I've done here is I put together just a quick 10-question, like I said, knowledge check. And I just posted the link into the chat pod there. Go into it on your own. We're not going to necessarily stay on the call to review answers necessarily. You'll know if the answers are right or wrong as you go through the knowledge check. It's not going to be graded, so please do it anyway. I don't want to discourage you from doing it all together, but it won't be graded, so I don't want you to have that kind of stress. But again, just 10 questions shouldn't take you just but a few minutes just to try to reiterate some important points. So with that, thank you guys all for sitting in and participating. With that, I will open the floor to anybody else that might want to make comments before we close out today. I'm seeing some interesting commentary in the chat pod, which I appreciate. And as a reminder, we did take attendance over the course of the session. So if you have attended this, then we'll get your AgLearn profile updated to reflect that you've completed this course. With that, happy Monday all. Have a good rest of your day and take care. Thanks again.